History of weapons throughout history minus guns, artillery, and machines. Which were the most influential weapons? Think now.
Was it one of these? If not, too bad. These are the ones I'll be going over. Each will be timestamped and 1.5 minutes to find them easier, and all my sources will be in the description, again, timestamped. If you want to do any further research, this is highly encouraged, as this is just a simple guide to the history of weapons throughout history. 100% human-made.
First, the Atlatl. Here are some images. This list is majoritarily influential weapons, and this is pretty niche. So what really surprised me when first researching was finding this. I assumed that for the Stone Age I was going to have to go with a stone tool or spear or some kind of that, but I've really found a gem. I think this is probably one of the most impressive engineering feats the early humans had, as this uses multiple laws of physics that they didn't have the knowledge, understanding, or mass to explain, but they still figured it out. It is even more impressive when it's discovered that all continents sub-Antarctica, meaning everyone discovered the optimal engineering solution to a problem they had all been dealing with, without communications between each other, truly showing human ingenuity. It works as an extension to the human arm. Look here.
We as humans are already incredibly efficient at throwing. The shoulder acts as the pivot, and momentum passes up the chain from legs to hips to torso to arm, each part adding more speed before it dumps it all into the hand at release. So by extending the arm, using the Atlatl for even more momentum, the spear shoots out faster than anything a human could ever throw, being capable of piercing large beasts,
with up to 60% more power according to many archaeologists.
And the speed isn't just for power in a spear. Making it faster can make it straighter, leading to more accurate hits and making it even more deadly. This is just such an incredibly impressive feat that it was one of the main reasons why I wanted to make this video, as it truly shows how we became the apex predators, not with our strength like other animals, but using our brains and new weapons and technology. Speaking of new technology, the composite bow.
Most featured this double convex design, which was a bow with the ends curved outwards, an essential upgrade from the normal curved bow, as it added more tension in the string, allowing the arrow to be fired faster. But that was invented almost 1,000 years before. I know, confusing. The true engineering was in the maximization of each property of different materials, as in a normal wooden bow, the limiting factor in power of the arrow is always how far the string can be pulled back before breaking. Let's start by trying to fix the problem. To see why the bow is breaking, let's categorize the forces acting on the bow into compression, squeezing, and tension, stretching, on this helpful infographic. Wood is bad at compression, so past a certain point it just breaks. However, by replacing the side that experiences the majority of the compression, the back, with a material like horn that has a low stiffness, this lets it flex and store energy under load instead of cracking straight away.
And while we're at it, let's use sinew for the front, as its fibers sit in a wavy pattern, so under tension they straighten out first before any real stiffness kicks in, letting it store more energy before snapping it all back into the arrow. Both of these acting in harmony allows our bow to bend back more, meaning we can put more power into drawing the bowstring, meaning the energy given to the arrow is greater as well, giving us the mastery of mechanics behind the composite bow.
Fun fact about the Khepesh, it comes from the Egyptian word for knee, which it kind of mimics. Personally, I found this weapon exciting, as you see forms of it throughout fiction, but I bet you never knew what it was called. Even though this sword is considered Egyptian due to its famous pharaohs being buried with one, like Tutankhamun, and it being a symbol of power, the majority of scholars currently agree it actually didn't originate there, but further north in Mesopotamia, later adopted by the ancient Egyptians. This means that it dates back to 2900 BC, though to note it was a carving, meaning it could be even older. Onto the actual blade, it was about 60 to 75 centimeters, about 2 rulers, with the last foot being curved and a handle big enough for at least a hand. This means that it was mainly a single-handed weapon. The blade was made out of bronze, which still competes with iron in genuine strength, but due to a lack of swordsmithing, sharpness and edge retention was lacking in quality. This was better for the time, because metal armors just hadn't really started being invented yet, so the Khepesh was just as deadly for its time as most of the other weapons on this list.
I actually wanted to talk about two very similar weapons. The earlier one, Halberd, was older and the start of every fantasy sword, being the first iron sword found, but in many ways this was a downgrade from a bronze sword. This is because iron is an element while bronze is an alloy, so the particles not being able to slide over each other makes it stronger and more durable. Then came its upgrade, Tene, steel. With new steel adding carbon to the iron, then hardening it, quenching, allows the blade to have a longer blade retention without sacrificing brittleness. The combination of hard edge and tough core is something that bronze and iron could not copy before, putting it into its own tier of material. This wasn't even the only thing, as Tene also were the first types of swords to get anthropomorphic hilts, which weren't new or an upgrade, but they look cool, like a little human. What really sets Le Tene apart were these three unique features, all coming together to make it ideal for heavy critical slashes. Double-edged, no fuller lenticular cross-section. First, the double edge. It's pretty self-explanatory. Both sides are sharpened, meaning you can attack in any orientation, meaning you rarely have to reposition using your large heavy weapon instead of using energy on attacking. The no fuller means it was full of metal instead of having these grooves to reduce the weight, meaning more damage. Finally, the lenticular design is the thick middle section acting as a spine to maintain shape. These all come together to maximize durability and damage, making it the template for fantasy iron swords. Now onto a spear of sorts, because this clearly isn't the first spear ever invented, but what I find most interesting was the warfare tactic it was used/designed for, the phalanx. You might have heard of this, as it's similar to the Roman tortoise, however this was much before, used by famous people like Philip II and Alexander the Great. It was conned the Macedonian phalanx. And the long sarissas were ideal for this tactic, as the wall of shields would slowly advance and the enemies with short swords and axes couldn't advance because the sarissas were packed so tightly together, slipping in between them and reaching the shield wall was incredibly difficult. This meant that without sacrificing many lives, you couldn't even attack the phalanx until they wanted you to attack them because of the range difference, making their offense basically into a defense. And this range that I keep talking about was the main standout feature, clearly, as I have been talking about it a lot. But how long was it actually? Using cubits, an old measurement system, scholars can estimate the length ranged from 3.8 meters to a massive 7.7 meters. Even using the low estimates of 3.8 meters, they are much longer than any weapons at the time, longer than 2 full men laying down. This also explains why it was so thin, as due to the law of moments, the longer it got, the more heavy it was. So by reducing the weight in the handle, they were able to keep the metal point at the end for damage and deadliness. The phalanx was even cooler, as it had 2 forms depending on how they held the sarissas, making it an extremely versatile weapon for the different phases of battle. First, the high guard, over the shoulder level with the enemy's face. As the face was the most exposed part, it was lethal, as well as being able to stab downwards over shields was easier. However, it came with risks, as it was hardest to control over the head and might inflict friendly fire, as well as leaving the armpit exposed, a very common weakness in the armour, as well as the obvious of making it more tiring. Then, the low guard, aimed at the torso, the most armoured part of the body, and with shield coverage. Thrusting towards the face from up here was slow and weak, since you had to awkwardly angle a heavy sarissa upwards, but you could stab faster and harder by being able to put your whole body behind it, while still having the capability of going under a shield, which wasn't as lethal, but still very effective. Now this was actually Roman. The Gladius was first written about in 361 BC. However, some sources say this is anachronistic, meaning it was dated to the wrong time period, being more accurately placed in 21 BC. But that doesn't even matter, because it was found separately from that in 200 BC, where the Romans made it for the Second Punic War. Now, onto the mechanics of the Gladius. First of all, how it was built. It had a 60 to 70 centimeter long blade that has, again, 2 rulers like the Khepesh. That is straight and double-edged, which we'd already learnt of. Furthermore, it was roughly 5 centimeters wide, with a diamond-shaped cross-section, which we've also seen. This was all to build it specifically for stabbing. As Roman writer Vigitus puts it, the Romans were taught to thrust over slash because thrusts were far more fatal and less tiring. A shallow 2-inch thrust into a vital area kills faster than a hacking and cutting, and it keeps the soldier's body mostly behind his shield, rather than committed to big swings, which would break the formation. Even though we've seen many of these features before, the reason why I still kept it in the video is because it is truly the first weapon that was perfected for its task. It was mainly used for stabbing, and everything built towards stabbing. There were no imperfections. It was durable and deadly. Plus, it had a lot of other benefits, as it could be used anywhere. The double-sidedness allowed slashing still, for example. A pilum is another Roman weapon that goes hand in hand with the Gladius, and I'll touch on that later. However, the being Roman part is debated among historians. At first, they thought the Romans stole it from the Samnites, another Italic tribe near central Italy. However, modern scholars don't fully accept this as evidence. It's pretty partial, and the origins pre-Roman are all literary and extremely contradictory and unreliable this far back. Anyways, the pilum was standard issue for legionaries. From roughly the mid-Republic through to the early Empire, it featured a long blade, 60 to 90 centimeters, with usually a small pyramid thing at the base to add weight, allowing for more pierce and power, mounted atop a long wooden shaft. The iron tip was designed by the Romans to bend on impact. This was a genius engineering design, if it was true, as they were mainly thrown from long range at the start of a battle, when they were closing the distance with their enemy.
The bending made it impossible to dislodge the pilum from a shield as it dragged along the ground, or even worse, from yourself. So, just before the first Romans reach the enemy's shield's walls are disrupted, meaning then the Romans can use their Gladius at a short range to pick off disgruntled enemies. Just to note, this is contested among specialists, however, as it can't consistently reproduce bending in current tests, and some specialists think that the pilum was built just to kill via mass and penetration, which would work with a 90cm blade, for sure, and the bending effect was either incidental or exaggerated by later interpretation. Now, for the powerful longbow. This was invented thousands of years ago, some dating back to 2600 BC, but really it started becoming popular and much more relevant in the medieval period, mainly due to heavy plated armour started popping up, especially throughout Europe, where it is mainly used. The longbow stood at about a height of 1.8 to 2.1 meters, meaning it was too big for horseback or running. This explains why it wasn't used much before armour, or as other bows did the same job and more. However, now they needed power, and that's what the longbow brung. On average, it took 120 pounds of force to pull back the bowstring, compared to the around 40 for the composite bow from before, and modern ones rarely exceed 70 pounds of force. Now we're going to do a little maths. So we're going to use the formula 1/2 times draw weight times drawback length. We're going to sub in draw weight as 120 pounds, converted into newtons, which is 533 newtons, and 0.7 meters for an estimated drawback length, according to our source. Put this all together and we get 197 joules, but according to this source, remember all sources are in the description, timestamps, so you can find this one very quickly, the wood coefficient is only 0.4, not 0.5, so we're going to sub that back in and we're going to get 157 joules stored within the bow, and with 80% efficiency going into the arrow, meaning it gets fired with 126 joules still. This is easily enough to pierce through mail padded leather and even some plates, depending on the quality. Now we're getting into the truly popular weapons. The halberd specifically has been referenced everywhere, and unlike the Khepesh, is probably extremely recognizable, especially because of its unique design. That design is what makes it so cool, because of its versatility. Most people could name the first two, the axe head and the pike, but the lesser-known hook on the opposite side to the axe was actually a very important feature on why it gained so much popularity in the late 1200s all the way through until firearms, withstanding the test of time. Let's go one by one down the list. The axe head first. It was the main damage dealer, using the law of moments for good this time, because mounting a heavy head at the end of a long stick multiplies the amount of damage it does by a lot, meaning it dealt fuck tons even through armor, without piercing it via blunt force trauma. The pike on top did a good job at keeping your opponent at a range from you, with a stab that could deal damage, although it was harder to wield than a regular spear due to the massive imbalance of weight on either side. Then the hook, the most unique feature, as it was specifically designed for anti-cavalry, as they took over Europe in the medieval period. The hook could snag onto reins, legs, or armor, dragging them off their high horse to the ground, where the axe does the rest of the work with them on the floor. This specific strategy has been referenced throughout history. For example, at Lorpen in 1339, the halberdiers formed a defensive circular hedgehog that could absorb cavalry charges because a mounted knight's lance simply couldn't reach past the wall of points. Same effect described again at Guttengate in 1479. The flanged mace was made entirely out of steel to keep the head and hexagonal shaft from separating when hit due to the sheer force you'd hit someone with. This would cave in armor, dealing massive blunt force trauma. Even if it didn't kill them, they'd still be left with broken bones and injuries beyond repair, especially for that time period. It was also small enough to be used as a one-handed weapon, but it was too heavy and short to be used effectively on the ground of the battlefield, so the mace was primarily featured atop horseback in the cavalry, so the horse could generate most of the speed to the mace dealing massive damage, and making the lack of range problem a little bit better. Also, due to the head, it looked incredibly cool, which is backed up by the fact that it got phased into a badge of rank later on in its life, due to its beautiful designs possible on the head. Obviously, just like the other weapons, it was made to solve a problem. The one that was the new types of heavy plated armor being worn in Europe mainly, which is why its relevant lifespan is estimated to be from around 1400 to 1600 AD. Now onto our final bow and our penultimate weapon, the crossbow. This is possibly the most mechanically advanced weapon on the list. And what's even more impressive is I don't know why it's this far up, as obviously the early trigger system, which sets it apart from the bow, was invented in China in 600 BC and Europe in 200 BC. But there are two types of different trigger systems. So even though one is older, I'm going to talk about the later, more advanced trigger system that was more medieval. But just to keep in mind how we invented something similar to a gun up to 2,600 years ago. So extremely impressive, and this was the main reason why I chose to make a video on this topic in the first place. Here's how it works. Draw, load, release, launch. First, you draw the string, loading all the tension into it, and because you don't have the deadly part in yet, this allowed crossbowmen to use their full body to draw the string, letting it rival the longbow in power. They could do this by using the loop at the front of the bow to put their foot in and use their entire body to draw it back. Then the load, slotting a metal bolt in, and that was all the setup you had to do. Now you could carry around a weapon of one-shot potential anywhere on horseback, or load another one until you need to release it. Pulling the trigger instantly elastically unloads all the tension into the arrow, transferring it all into kinetic energy as it flies forwards at 60 to 90 meters per second, ripping through armor and flesh. And even if, with your full body, the crossbow didn't allow you to pull it back with as much tension as the longbow, having the metal bolt, which due to their weight would release with more energy and could pierce through full metal plates from anywhere, earning crossbowmen the nickname of hateful to God, comparing them to the devil. Now we end on the katana, and I know you're picturing a legendary unbreakable blade forged in a fire by a master who prayed over every fold. But that's just the story everyone tells. It's not the real one. Japanese smiths worked with a steel called tamahanga, pulled out of a furnace called a Atlatl, using iron sand instead of iron ore. The catch is, that process gives you messy, inconsistent steel. So smiths had to sort through it by hand and fold the good high carbon bits around a softer core just to hold the blade together. That folding technique everyone treats like ancient magic, it was just damage control for bad raw material. And when modern metallurgists put tamahanga for a real lab testing against normal steel today, it holds up about the same as basic carbon steel. No secret sharpness, no mystical strength. So where did the legend come from? Turns out, it was peacetime samurai, centuries later looking back at their ancestors and building up the katana as the sacred symbol of honor. Then Japan exported that idea to the world, right where everyone wanted to believe it. And that kind of thing is amazing on its own. A weapon that turned a technical weakness into one of the most powerful legends in history, being referenced everywhere, in every game, and in every medium. So it wasn't the best blade, but it had the best story, and that's why I kept it at the end, so you watched the whole video all the way through for my retention, because who the fuck would stay for the crossbow? Like and subscribe, like and subscribe, like and subscribe, yippee, I'm finally free.